Okay, this lecture or video is going to be about Plato's Symposium, and I put it at this point because Socrates' speech, or Diotima's speech to Socrates, follows really closely with Carl Jung's view of animus and anima and the need of men to assimilate the anima and balance out animus and anima. But before that, way before that, I need to talk about the symposium in relationship to the themes that came out, especially in Homer, but also in tragedy and these other themes. Um, so I'll talk about that for a while, and I'll eventually get to anima. Okay, the symposium starts out with this very complicated discussion about who's telling who the story of this drinking party. So there's some famous drinking party occurred where Socrates was present and Aristodemus was present, and Aristodemus was in love with Socrates, but you can't tell if he really understood Socrates or why he loved Socrates, because his love for Socrates motivated him to walk around barefoot and kind of imitate him in this very superficial way. But on the other hand, Aristodemus shows a little bit of insight because on his way to the drinking party, Socrates gets lost in contemplation, and Agathon wants to know if he should send a servant to go after him, and Aristodemus says, no, no, he'll come when he's ready. So it's really hard to tell if why Aristodemus loved Socrates and then what he would think of Socrates, because one of the themes is based on what you love, your soul, you will be attracted to people or repulsed by people. You will think of people one way or another way. You'll project yourself into them, correct? And then also Eros is described by Socrates as a mediator between the gods and men, and each man's Eros in his soul is the part of his psyche that's trying to aspire to the divine, to becoming a beautiful soul or truth or justice, or it might be aspiring to power or glory or pleasure. I mean, whatever it aspires to, whatever it lives for, is Eros, is what drives people. So people are going to tell this story and think of Socrates according to their own Eros, what it is they're passionate about. So Aristodemus was there, but Apollodorus is the one that is described as being in love with Socrates, and he asks Aristodemus to tell him the story about this, or he had asked about this drinking party, and he had the details confirmed by Socrates, and now someone is asking him to tell the story. Glaucon is asking him to tell the story, and no, he had just told the story to Glaucon, and now this other person is asking him to tell it again. So he's telling it twice, and Glaucon had heard the story from someone else who seemed to have gotten it mixed up. That person heard the story from Phoenix, and who heard the story from Aristodemus. So what's going on here? The idea is that somehow this drinking party was important. It triggered people's passions. People want to tell the story. And if somebody, how they tell the story is a function of their eros. So somebody got it garbled up. Well, probably because he doesn't love wisdom, he doesn't care, he can't remember. On the other hand, Apollodorus, he might tell the story according to his own eros. He'll remember the parts that means something to him. And he even says that. He says, well, I might not remember it all. And then at a certain point when he's telling, he said, oh, there were a few other speeches I can't remember, but I'll go on. Which is, of course, exactly what happens to me when I'm trying to give these quickie lectures on Plato's dialogues, or I'm trying to tell you about what I learned from reading Plato. I know that it has a whole lot to do with me. But they're all acting as mediators, right? And so they are erotic, and they are all manifestations of Eros, because there's no disembodied Eros. Eros manifests itself in people, and it motivates people. It leads to ways of life. There's no difference between an Eros and an ergon, a way of life. So Socrates' way of life is motivated by the love of wisdom. Anyway, so finally, Plato is, of course, telling the reader the story, right? And so, okay, so Plato must have heard the story from somebody. He was only 12 years old when the actual party occurred, and then people started telling stories, so you don't know. You know that he must have heard it from somebody. He probably confirmed it with Socrates, just like Apollodorus did, but he's telling a different version, or else he's telling his version of what Apollodorus would have told. So we have to kind of figure out, well, what the heck's going on, and how is it getting filtered, and what does it really tell us about Athens? All right. The second point is that it's called Symposium, and I talked about that tradition of people having symposia in their houses, and the way the city had an institutional structure for it and encouraged it, because they wanted people to cultivate practical wisdom. And a lot of times in the public realm, out in the public space, either you don't have time to talk about what you really care about, or you might also not say exactly what you think, because you have to maintain a reputation. You don't want the rumors to get around that you had said something. So in private houses, you're more likely to say what you really think, even though Socrates always asks people to tell him what they really think. There are plenty of times when the sophists don't, because they're aware that their possible students, paying students, their source of income is listening, and they have to come across as very reputable characters. But anyway, in this private home, they can say what they like, and they do. And it's about Eros. And they also sort of establish, just like they're supposed to, they set up a bunch of rules. They make their collective decisions about what kind of an event it's going to be, and then they follow their own rules until the end, when Alcibiades blows the whole thing up. So it doesn't really remain a very ordered event. Okay, and then and it's also titled ironically, which is, I will show, is a pattern in Plato's dialogues. All the dialogues are titled, when they have people for names, the person is a tragic character. They make a mistake in judgment. Phaedrus made a mistake when he clearly didn't learn what Socrates was trying to get at. He kept thinking that this was a contest of speeches and seduction speeches, instead of a serious turning around toward the love of wisdom. And that was unfortunate, because Phaedrus had a bright future and he blew it. His life was dissipated, and he didn't make the contribution he should have been able to make to the city. Okay, so when Plato's dialogues are named after people, they follow the pattern of tragedy. People make a mistake in judgment, and it leads them historically to a disaster. But they're a type of person who can make a type of mistake. Anybody reading the dialogue could understand, identify, and fear for their own ability to do that. Okay, so, but when a dialogue is named the Republic or the Symposium, those titles are ironic, so it appears to be a symposium, but it's not really a symposium. There's this difference between appearance and reality. You're supposed to have this reversal and recognition. And why is that so? Well, it becomes clear that this tradition of symposia had become just orgies where they hired flute players to play the flute, they drank a lot, and they had sex with the flute players because the flute players were prostitutes. So it had just turned into this sex and drinking, Dionysian revelry, and it was not cultivating practical wisdom, and it was not the original intent of the founders who institutionalized this. And the people, the Athenians don't even realize that. They have no idea what the original idea was. Their responsibility to cultivate practical wisdom, citizenship, the wisdom of a citizen. So that's kind of discouraging. The whole thing is very discouraging. And the reason why everybody's obsessed about hearing this story is that the dialogue is set at this moment when everybody wants to hear the story, is right after Alcibiades has been killed. And everybody wants to hear the story about when Socrates and Alcibiades went at it at a drinking party and had a real knockdown, drag-out argument. But what had happened then is that Alcibiades had become a very arrogant man and a traitor to Athens, and he helped the Spartans win the war. And he finally died far away from Athens, and everybody wanted to hear about this. How did it start out? How did it come to this? Okay, so the next point is that it starts out talking about how Socrates runs into someone. He's on his way to a party at Agathon's house. Agathon has just won the prize for being the best tragedian. His plays won. He was elected best. This is the second night after the performance, I think. But it doesn't matter. I mean, basically, Socrates has actually taken a bath and he put on some shoes. He's actually dressed up, and everybody's going, wow, Socrates, you're really serious. This must be quite a special party. But on his way to the party, he starts contemplating and he starts staring into space. And that's where Aristodemus gets there and looks around and goes, where's Socrates? And he goes, I don't know. I didn't even notice he stopped. And then Agathon says, should I get a servant to get him? And Aristodemus says, no, don't bother. He'll come. He knows where it is. But at the end of the dialogue, toward the end, when Alcibiades is talking about Socrates, he also talks about where Socrates was staring into space. So, and just contemplating something. This was while he was on a military campaign, and it was actually pretty cold, and he was in bare feet, and he was stared for about 24 hours. So, the point here is that, yes, Socrates has a contemplative side. His mind, part of his mind is focused on the universe. He has this holistic vision. He can have these mystical moments, but he is not a mystic, and he always comes back into the city. He always talks to anybody who will talk to him about the serious questions, because he wants to embody a full, flourishing life. He wants to be exercising all of the powers of soul. And insofar as he is able, he wants to inspire everybody else at whatever sector of society, young and old, anybody, to love wisdom. And he wants to hold their feet to the fire. If they say they love money, they've got to admit that then they also want everybody else to love money, and it's going to be competitive, and they're going to be miserable. You can't have a double standard. So he's always trying to incarnate and bring into being a higher level, that he's trying to bring the good life, justice, virtue into people's lives, to incarnate them, incarnate these virtues, because that's what the forms are. They're the actual people living out a way of life that embodies virtue and justice. So he's totally committed to maximizing the embodiment of virtue, justice, truth, beauty. So anyway, we have this description of him staring into space on his way to a drinking party, and staring into space out in the military campaign. So again, we have these two issues of Aphrodite and Ares, and this is the whole symposium is about Aphrodite and Ares. So finally, Socrates gets there, and Agathon decides, he says to the servants, well, why don't you pretend that you're the masters, and you, I can't remember, but he turns tradition upside down. And the dialogue is constantly having this reversal going on, from this turning around from the status quo, or what's considered normal, to exactly the reverse. And it also indicates that the two kinds of souls that are farthest from the general order of social society, the following the rules and laws and being a decent citizen, the two farthest from that are Socrates and Alcibiades, the philosopher who does not do anything because the laws say so, does not obey the leaders in order to gain public recognition, or for fear of public rejection, but has his own reasons for living his life based on the mind. He's always driven by his mind and indifferent to the rules and regulations of his particular society. He can always criticize them as better or worse based on natural principles of truth and justice. On the other hand, the tyrannical soul, Alcibiades, wants to wrap the whole city around his little finger, and get people to do whatever he wants them to do. And he also is totally indifferent to laws, institutions, habits, tradition, any kind of social order. Okay, so they come to the party. Socrates finally gets there, and they talk about, the flute players are there, and some of them have a hangover. The drinkers have a hangover. Aristophanes, Agathon, the pleasure seekers, Pausanias. And so they decide they don't want to drink tonight. So they get rid of the flute player. And then they decide Phaedrus is first, and he says, in all the traditions and all the speeches and all this stuff, I've never heard anyone give a speech in honor of Eros. And you're just, huh? I mean, obviously, according to Plato's dialogues, Socrates gave him one hell of a seduction speech about Eros. He gave him this phenomenal speech about Eros. So Phaedrus didn't get it. He can't remember that, right? He doesn't remember. Or he also doesn't understand the whole mythological tradition is about Eros. The whole tragedy, Homer, all of these things are about Eros. So that should be an eye-opener, and the other people in the room agree or they don't disagree. So again, there's a signal that they completely lost track of what their religious system and their educational system and their tradition of tragedy was trying to do to the human psyche. It was trying to transform Eros from the dark shadow to the golden shadow. And this is particularly ironic since Agathon is there, and when he gives his speech, it's clear that he's anti tragic. His view of the world is not at all tragic. And yet he's getting elected number one. So the Athenians have completely lost it. And so the symposium is about the corruption of Eros. And if the Eros of the citizens is corrupt, their passion, their desire, that's what motivates people. They might have all the wonderful opinions and principles, moral principles, but in a critical moment when they're setting up their life plan, it's their eros that determines what they do. So Phaedrus and Euryximachus is the doctor, and they're both temperate. They don't have hangovers, but they decide they want to have a symposium, and Euryximachus sets up the structure. He's the doctor. So, and they're going to give speeches to Eros and take turns, and they're going to go from left to right. And okay, so so the thing about it, Plato is saying, it appears to be a traditional symposia. It appears that these guys are respecting the traditions of Athens, and they're deluded into thinking that they really are good Athenian citizens, and they do believe that they love their city's traditions, and they do believe they're the best. I mean, they're number one, of course, but their eros is completely corrupted, and they don't care about wisdom, and so they don't understand the point of what was supposed to make Athens different and better. Athens was structured for the cultivation of wisdom. None of these guys love wisdom or even think they have any obligation to. Okay, so the next thing is the story of Paris was that Paris had three choices: Aphrodite, Hera, or Athena. Aphrodite said, if you choose me, I'll give you the most beautiful woman in the world. You can choose pleasure and wealth. And the city of Troy represents a society dedicated to pleasure and wealth. Hera said, if you choose me, I'll give you power. And the Achaeans in Homer and also in the tragedies I've talked about are obsessed with power, and that leads to their self-destruction. They destroyed themselves from within. And then Athena says, if you give me the golden apple, I will give you the love of wisdom. And of course, Paris makes the wrong choice. But Homer, again, has the love of wisdom should have been what motivated the Trojans and the Achaeans, but the Trojans rejected that. They let Paris have his woman, and they were dedicated to wealth. Priam thought he could buy off his enemies. The Achaeans started out with the just cause, the preservation of hospitality agreements, international law, but they got so obsessed with power that they got totally disorganized, and they were internally chaotic. And then when Achilles finally agreed to fight, they were fighting for all the wrong reasons. They were fighting to gain glory, to avoid shame, to and just to win, to show the Trojans who's boss, to protect to give Menelaus back his woman. None of the reasons that were right, so they were all wrong. Nobody chose Athena, and this is where Odysseus and Athena, um, Odysseus is the one who represents closest to the ideal, but he makes mistakes. It's just that there clearly is a possibility besides those other two goals. Um, okay, so then the thing about the Symposium that shows that the souls of the Athenians are completely corrupted is that when they start talking, first of all, they say nobody's ever talked about Eros. Like their myths and tragedies don't talk about anything else. Um, and then, secondly, all of the speeches are worshiping either Ares or Aphrodite or both. Oh my gosh. And it's just like, oh my gosh, really? Boy, did you not learn anything from Homer, especially. Oh, it just, blows your mind, takes your breath away that they think they're honoring their tradition, and they actually have completely destroyed it. All they have is the appearance of a civilization, but their real soul is totally barbaric. All right, so Phaedrus is the first one to speak. Well, let me just summarize a few more things. That Phaedrus represents the young people in the military. Um, Pausanias represents the legal system. He's a lawyer. Euryximachus represents the medical profession. He's a doctor. Aristophanes is a comedian, so he represents the arts, specifically comedy. And Agathon represents, he's a tragedian, the arts in relation to tragedy. And Alcibiades represents the political leaders, what's going on with power, decisions about war, and other political decisions. So the dialogue, the leaders as opposed to the soldiers who fight in the war. So the dialogue is showing how all these positions of authority, the leadership in all these sectors of society in Athens had become completely corrupted. And they were in love with Ares, Aphrodite, or some mix. Oh my gosh, and they're in complete denial. And they didn't learn anything. Okay, so Phaedrus starts out by idealizing war and the love of glory in war. And he talks about how a pairing of that soldiers pair off in twos, and they are motivated they develop a bond in relationship to this common threat. And they inspire each other to fight bravely because they don't want to be humiliated in front of their friend. And so Phaedrus thinks that this is the most noble kind of love, is this common love that enables you to transcend the fear of death and to achieve glory. All right, so in the Phaedrus dialogue, Phaedrus was the sex toy, right? He was everybody's sexual object, and he was preoccupied with sex. He was playing, talking about making sex jokes and sexual references and all that. So he was being corrupted by his elders, and he was buying into it, and he was preoccupied with pleasure and sex. Well, now he's given that up, and now he's really preoccupied with being a brave young man and being macho and going out there in war. And he's fantasizing about it. Okay, he hasn't really been there yet. So he's fantasizing about being masculine and living for glory and overcoming pleasure for the sake of glory and power. All right, well, so he's definitely silly putty in the hands of some leader, political leader or military leader, that sends him off to war or sends him off to a massacre in war. He'll do anything. Um, and his speech starts out from Eros as a natural drive. So again, just like in Hesiod, Eros was one of the four natural forces. It was Thanatos, Eros, Chaos, and Gaia. Okay, so Gaia was the earth, and chaos was what there was originally, and then through the powers of Eros and Thanatos, love and aggression, okay, hate, love and hate, or attraction and repulsion, um, things gradually evolved on Earth. So, okay, Phaedrus starts out and he basically worships war. Um, so he represents Ares. Oh boy. So he is like Paris. He had the choice, and first he chose pleasure and then he chose power, but he never chose the love of wisdom. And what actually happened to him, not long after the dialogue took place, was Alcibiades, who's a super aggressive guy, which I'll talk about later, convinced him and some other friends to go out one night and mutilate the Hermes, the statues of Hermes, which I assume would mean knock off the erect penis, and get ostracized, vilified, basically self-destruct in terms of having much of a future in Athens. So his glorification of war led to this aggression, this excess aggression, and to the loss of the potential he had to have not only a brilliant future for himself, but to make a contribution to the society. Athens needed these young men from the best families to take on positions of leadership and authority and to rule for the well-being of the ruled. And he was just a lost cause. Okay, then the next one is Pausanias. Pausanias is an older man and a lawyer, and he is sleeping with Agathon. He's in one of those mentor-mentee relationships, and he's giving a seduction speech to Agathon. Basically, he's trying to convince Agathon that he should keep sleeping with him forever. Okay, so, and he justifies the laws in Athens, and he describes Athens as the mean between extremes. So he definitely has the lingo of don't go to an extreme, don't overreach. That was the theme in Homer, the theme in tragedy. He's totally misapplied it. Okay, which Aristotle says people do, and which people do in all those tragedies. So, on the one hand, he said, well, we're not barbarians like the Boethians, because all the Boethians do is kind of grunt and point at the person they want to sleep with, and they get in bed and have sex. Nothing pretty. It's not civilized, it's just sex. Whereas in Athens, you have this whole courtship process. You have to write a seduction speech. You have to hope that the young man will choose your seduction speech over somebody else's. and Pausanias distinguishes between the divine Aphrodite and the vulgar Aphrodite. So some of those old geezers are really dirty old men, but there's these other kind that are really divine, and they have their sex, like gourmet food. They have sophisticated sex. Okay, a great seduction speech for Agathon. He's totally deluded. He's just as much of a dirty old man as the other guys. He's just sophisticated about it. He uses bigger words in his speeches. But on the other extreme is Sparta. He condemns Sparta because they just repress pleasure and sex, and they don't have any culture. They're just dedicated to war. So Athens is the really civilized place. um, okay. And then he also describes these relationships, and it's really interesting because Lysias described the relationships as a corrupting influence because the older man had took complete power over the younger man and crippled him, kept him at home, kept him ignorant, kept him dependent. Well, Pausanias is worried about his investment in Agathon, and I think he's worried that Agathon is going to leave, and Agathon, as a matter of fact, does leave not long after this speech, and he chases after a much younger guy and a tyrant, like a very aggressive guy. So Pausanias is trying to advertise himself as a nice, gentle old man who has really wonderful, sophisticated sex. And it doesn't work. Turns out Agathon wanted something else, something more virile. But anyway, Pausanias is, oh, I can't remember what I was going to say. Anyway, he he represents pleasure, Aphrodite, and he doesn't think there's anything wrong with that. Oh yeah, when he describes the relationships, he worries about the abuse of the older guy by the younger guy, and so he talks about how the older guy invests his money and his time in this younger man, and sometimes those younger men, they just take the older guy's money and they take his prestige. They gain prestige from sleeping with one guy as opposed to another, and then they go off. And when the older guy needs him the most, when his powers are deteriorating, the younger guy cuts and runs with all of his money and with the status and all these other benefits. So that's interesting that the corruption and the abuse can go either way. But the bottom line is, it's obvious why Socrates did not sleep with his students and why Plato thought this relationship is an incredibly corrupting influence. And it's very much a part of why Athens fell apart. Because that mentoring relationship is key for assimilating the shadow and developing a passion for what's good. The other point I want to make that Alcibiades says later on is he says every one of you at this table got engaged in the philosophical frenzy with Socrates. Every one of them had a relationship like the one described in the Phaedrus dialogue. So the Phaedrus dialogue is just an archetype or a pattern for the kind of engagement Socrates tried to pull them away from the Lysiases of Athens, which is just about everybody else, and tried to help them assimilate their shadow, not to act on the basis of pleasure, instinct, power, and try to get them to love wisdom. And clearly he failed in all the cases, but anyway, so Pausanias is deluded. The other thing these guys do is they deny their own shadow, okay? They project onto somebody else the dark side, and they idealize themselves. So Phaedrus denies the dark side of war, even though Ares clearly represents the awful destruction when you just worship war as a goal. And so he's in complete denial. I mean, he describes Eros, this kind of Eros, as a natural force. So he has this notion of some kind of noble savage, pre-civilized, where the presuppositions in Greek culture and literature and Athens society is that we're born neither good nor evil, but those instincts have to be educated. If they're not, there's trouble. So they're really against some kind of noble savage. Definitely not in Hesiod, and it's not in any of the documents. So Phaedrus totally doesn't get it. He idealizes himself, he idealizes war, he idealizes aggression, military aggression. Pausanias idealizes sex, and he also has this noble savage kind of myth where there's natural sex, pleasure, but he says there's a vulgar Aphrodite and a divine Aphrodite, and some of us just have the divine one. The vulgar one is totally just tied to the physical, but the other one is tied to the spiritual. If you really were spiritual, you would skip the sex altogether, is what Socrates says. Not because you repress Eros, but because it always turns into this power struggle, which is exactly what Pausanias describes, so we should know better. Anyway, so he idealizes Aphrodite, and he denies his own shadow. He also tries to act like he's totally in control, but obviously he's worried that he's going to get rejected. He has a shadow side that he denies, and lo and behold, that is what happens. Okay, the third one is Euryximachus, the doctor, and his Eros, he talks about harmonia, harmony, and harmony is actually the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite. Oh, okay, so Ares and Aphrodite are insanely attracted to each other, and then they get repulsed and they break apart. So obviously, harmony, and this is true in families often when the parents conflict a lot, a child will be obsessed with creating harmony, doesn't want any conflict, and so when they become parents, nobody gets to be angry. There's no there's no aggression, and we're going to have a very gentle, harmonious relationship. I don't care how much sex it has, as long as everybody's happy. Okay, I know people like that. Nobody gets angry, nobody. Okay, so he says that the art of medicine is the art of creating harmony. And so you can't live without him. So he's saying that his profession is absolutely necessary for people to live well. And what that assumes is by nature we are irrational. We are in conflict. And we can't live without this weaving together, this medicine given by the doctor. And so he's justifying his own profession. Socrates would say that it's a perversion, it's a lie, but it's a self-justifying lie. So he demonizes human nature in order to idealize his own power and importance. And Plato says in the Republic that there's two ways of being a doctor, exercising medicine. One of them is a person is basically healthy, but they get sick. So the doctor gives them a potion and they throw up and have diarrhea, and the poison either leaves their body and they're back at work in 3 days, or they die. That's it. They're naturally healthy. Then there's this other way of being a doctor, where you figure out all the different aches and pains people get, sometimes because of their intemperance, their obesity, or their drunkenness, or their lack of exercise, or bad habits of various kinds, and you figure out how to pander to them instead of telling them, well, okay, you're sick, that's a consequence of the way you live. They develop all these potions and drugs and diet pills and all sorts of liposuction so that people don't really have to suffer the consequences of their excesses. And you make a lot of money. You can even convince people that it's natural to want excesses, and so doctors are absolutely indispensable, and you better pay them a lot of money. Also, he talks about in the Republic about trying to keep people alive whose bodies are trying to die, and you can make a lot of money on that. Now, an indication in the Symposium that this is what Eryximachus is about, and Plato wants you to see that, is that Aristodemus was supposed to speak before Eryximachus, but he had a terrible case of the hiccups. And we find out that Aristodemus is actually a lover of Aphrodite and Dionysus. He loves to drink and eat too much. And so he would get the hiccups. He was eating too fast or drinking too much. And Eryximachus gives him three or four different things, ways to cure his hiccups. So this just shows that Eryximachus is an absolute, has completely bought in to being the kind of doctor that doesn't criticize people's excesses. Aristophanes is his friend. Okay? Well, of course, because Aristophanes needs him, and Eryximachus needs the status, the money, and the power he gets from people who are wealthy but intemperate and come to him and pay him so that they don't have to suffer the consequences of their behavior. So they're friends, and Eryximachus is one of those corrupt doctors. And so he gives this principle of nature. He gives this image of nature as by nature and the human soul are out of whack. They go to extremes all the time, and people need this doctor to create harmony from nothing. It's a culture superimposed on nature. Now, Plato and Socrates would say no, that excess is not natural and it's not healthy. And you should, if you live an examined life, and you live the life of the mind, you won't go to excess. And this is Book 6 of the Republic, the unified soul. You just won't be interested because you'll be so much in love with wisdom. You won't be repressing your desires and appetites. You just won't be interested. You'll eat when you need to eat. And Socrates does that. He goes to drinking parties and he drinks. Alcibiades even says he can hold his liquor better than anybody else. He never gets drunk. When there's food and drink around, he enjoys it. But when they're on a military campaign and they're all starving, he never complains. So he's just indifferent. He doesn't repress appetites, but he certainly doesn't go to excess. And that's the natural person. That's the way the lover of wisdom lives. And by nature, that's what we are designed to seek wisdom. Our condition, our capacities. To be a flourishing human being, we have to seek wisdom. So that's the healthy attitude. So Eryximachus is also deluded, in denial, and has a speech about the nature of reality that makes him, number one, justifies his way of life, which they're all doing, right? Phaedrus justifies his love of war. Pausanias justifies his affair with Agathon, and Eryximachus is justifying himself and his profession. Okay, so Aristophanes is the next one. He finally got over the hiccups, and he invents this creature. He talks about hermaphrodite. Hermaphrodisiacs, okay? So he has these creatures that he says originally people were round, they were cyclical, and they were male and female together, and they rolled around, and they were very powerful because they didn't have all that vulnerability that people have when they don't feel whole, and they feel like they've got to find their soulmate, and they're unhappy on their own. So they used to be perfectly happy on their own, and for that reason, they were very strong, and they rolled up to the top of Mount Olympus, and they tried to defy the gods. And the gods got mad at that, seemed arrogant, so they sliced them in half. And then they had to turn the genitals around. And so they sliced them in half, and then they took the skin and folded it, and that's what the navel is. You tie it like a balloon or something. And then you have to turn the genitals around. And now people feel incomplete, and they're always looking for their soulmate. And they're roaming around. And when they find them, of course, they have sex with them. That's what they're missing out on. And some of them were female and female, those are lesbians. Some of them were male and male, those are homosexuals. And some of them were heterosexual, right? Male and female. And then Aristophanes says the most virile, the best ones, were the male and male. So again, Aristophanes is affirming that male on male sex. And he also really talks about it in a pretty aggressive, sexual aggression, like in the name of looking for your soulmate. It sounds great, right? We're all looking for our soulmate. When you really think about what these people are doing, is they have sex with somebody and then they go, oh, I don't think you are my soulmate. I'll try somebody else. And so it's sexual free-for-all, which is, what Aristophanes was like and what he thought was great. Again, he's confirming that tradition that Pausanias was confirming, but he's okay with a lot more running around and a lot more aggression than Pausanias is. But again, Socrates doesn't do that. He's monogamous. He's married, has a wife and kids, and he leaves his sexuality at home. And Plato shows you why that's the right way to go, because all of this other sexuality, no matter how much you try to idealize it or explain it, it's wrong, and it's a corrupting influence. And Aristophanes also says that we should never question the gods, because if we try to defy the gods again, they'll cut us in half again, and we'll be hopping around on one foot. So, underneath this funny story, Aristophanes likes being the entertainer, and he wants to be popular. He can't give up on that. He also was a great believer in free speech, right? Typical of an artist. But he didn't self-censor. And free speech meant he could say anything about anybody, and that was the great thing about Athens. So he wrote a play called The Clouds, where he completely trashed Socrates and had this image of him as this guy up in the clouds and running this school that's basically a corrupting influence. So Aristophanes used his free speech to write plays, comedies that vulgarized taste, and that fueled animosity between people, and he abused his free speech. Plato is trying to show us that if you really want a stable society where people are cultivating wisdom, and if you really want a non-authoritarian society where people rule and are ruled in turn, you will not abuse free speech. You will not use it to create animosity between people, because as soon as you create animosity, you create the need for some higher authority, for tougher laws, and for enforcement of those laws, which would be you put hands in the power in the hands of people who are able to throw you in jail or fine you or limit your life in order to maintain social stability and social order. And so Plato and Socrates don't preach to people. They don't say, you shouldn't say that. They say, look what happened. Aristodemus was a great believer in free speech. He used it in ways that fueled animosity, including animosity towards Socrates, and Athenian democracy was undermined and ultimately destroyed. So he had the wrong idea. The point of Athens was the cultivation of wisdom, not just being able to say anything you dang please. Okay, so that's Aristophanes. He appears to be funny, and he really is not so funny. Okay, there's also a theme which runs through Hesiod about the relationship between the older generation and the younger generation. And I'm going to cut this off. It's about 56 minutes, so I'm going to go to the next video before I finish. I'm not going to be finished for a while yet.